Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a city so enormous, so crowded, and so alive that if you had walked through its streets 1,000 years ago, you would have believed you were standing inside the heart of the world itself. Long before towering skylines rose above Europe, before London became a giant of stone and smoke, there existed a place in ancient America filled with markets, temples, musicians, fishermen, priests, farmers, thieves, and wandering travelers. A place where tens of thousands of people lived beside vast, shining waters under skies painted with fire-red sunsets. And yet, this city vanished so completely that forests swallowed its roads, silence covered its plazas, and for centuries, nobody even imagined how immense it once was. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of a young canoe builder named Aketo, who arrives at this legendary city at the very moment whispers of danger begin drifting through its crowded canals. The people still laugh. Merchants still shout across marketplaces. Children still race through alleyways. But somewhere beyond the distant horizon, famine, fear, and chaos are already moving closer. So dim the lanterns. Settle into your blankets. Maybe keep a soft fan humming in the background. And let us drift slowly into the ancient night together. The morning fog rolled across the water like pale smoke when Aketo first saw the city. For nearly 5 days, he had traveled south through endless wetlands, paddling beside thick reeds that swayed under the cries of unseen birds. His arms ached from steering the canoe against slow-moving currents, and his back burned from sleeping beneath damp hides each night. Yet none of that mattered anymore, because there, beyond the silver mist, rose something larger than any village he had ever imagined. Wooden towers climbed above the shoreline. Hundreds of rooftops stretched beside the water. Smoke curled upward from cooking fires, and somewhere in the distance came the low, steady rhythm of drums. Aketo rested his paddle across his knees and stared silently. His uncle, old Menewa, sat near the back of the canoe chewing dried fish. The old man noticed the expression on the boy's face and grunted softly. "You thought the traders exaggerated," Menewa said. Aketo nodded slowly. Back in their northern settlement, travelers spoke of Cahokia as if it belonged to dreams. They claimed the city held more people than the stars visible over the river. They spoke of gigantic earthen pyramids, crowded plazas, endless marketplaces, and canals packed with boats carrying copper, shells, salt, fur, and sacred stones from lands thousands of miles away. Aketo had never fully believed them. Now he understood they had not exaggerated enough. As the canoe drifted closer, details emerged through the fog. The shoreline swarmed with activity. Men unloaded woven baskets from long trading boats. Women washed garments beside wooden docks. Dogs barked furiously at one another, while children chased through the mud barefoot and laughing. Nearby, fishermen untangled nets heavy with shining silver fish, and above everything towered the great mound. It rose from the earth like a man-made hill, larger than anything nature should have allowed. Terraces climbed toward the sky in enormous layers, each perfectly shaped. At its summit stood a massive wooden building painted red and white. Aketo could barely breathe while looking at it. "How many people live here?" he whispered. Menewa shrugged. "More than counting can hold." They guided the canoe toward a crowded dock where dozens of travelers already waited. Voices echoed everywhere. Different languages mixed together in the morning air. Some traders wore feathered cloaks, bright as flowers. Others carried heavy packs of copper tools or stone carvings strapped across their shoulders. Aketo stepped onto the dock carefully, almost slipping on wet wood. The city smelled unlike anything he knew. Smoke, fish, wet earth, sweat, cooked corn, burning cedar. Thousands upon thousands of people living close together created a strange warmth in the air, even during morning coolness. Menewa slapped the boy lightly across the shoulder. "Stay close," he warned. "Cities swallow fools." They moved through the riverside district, where narrow paths twisted between crowded homes built from wood and packed clay. The noise overwhelmed Aketo almost immediately. Potters shouted prices. Drummers played rhythms beside dancers wearing shell jewelry. Priests carrying painted staffs passed through crowds, while people lowered their eyes respectfully. Everywhere he looked, more people appeared. The city seemed endless. Back home, everyone knew one another. Here, strangers brushed shoulders every second without exchanging names. At one corner of the market, a man cooked cakes of maize over hot stones, while another sold smoked meat from hanging racks. Nearby, women traded dyed cloth woven in complicated patterns. Aketo even spotted objects he could not identify. Green stones polished smooth as water delicate carved masks, tiny copper bells that chimed softly in the wind. A young girl no older than 10 darted through the crowd carrying baskets balanced on her head. She nearly collided with Aketo before disappearing again. Menewa laughed quietly. "You walk like a deer entering a wolf den. I've never seen anything like this." "Nobody has," the old man replied. They continued deeper toward the city center, where the roads widened dramatically. Soon, Aketo realized the streets themselves were carefully planned. Large open plazas separated districts from one another, and tall wooden poles carved with symbols stood at important crossings. Then he saw the mounds. Not just one, dozens. Some were small, rounded hills. Others rose high, with stairways climbing their sides. Certain mounds held temples where smoke drifted endlessly from sacred fires. Others supported homes belonging to nobles or priests. People moved constantly across the giant central plaza. Thousands of footprints had packed the earth so tightly it felt almost hard as stone beneath Aketo's sandals. At the far end stood the largest mound of all, Monk's Mound, though Aketo did not yet know its name. Its shadow stretched across the plaza like a dark hand. Menewa stopped walking and pointed toward it. The Sun Chief lives there. Aketo swallowed nervously. He had heard stories about the rulers of Cahokia. Some claimed they could command the seasons themselves. Others believed they spoke directly to spirits living inside storms. Will we see him? Aketo asked. Menewa snorted. Do you think rulers wait outside greeting canoe builders? Before Aketo could answer, sudden shouting erupted nearby. A crowd gathered around two men wrestling in the dirt. One accused the other of stealing shells. People cheered while the fighters slammed into one another beneath clouds of dust. Children laughed wildly. An old woman screamed insults from the edge of the crowd. Finally, guards arrived carrying long staffs and separated the men roughly. The crowd dispersed almost instantly. Aketo stared after the guards. Even they looked different from ordinary people. Their cloaks carried painted symbols, and copper ornaments hung from their necks. This place never sleeps, he muttered. Menewa's expression darkened slightly. No great city ever truly rests. By midday, the heat became heavy and damp. Aketo helped unload cedar logs brought from northern forests. Canoe builders in Cahokia paid well for strong wood, and Menewa intended to trade everything before winter floods began. As they worked near the canal, Aketo noticed something strange. Several workers whispered nervously while glancing toward the southern districts. One of them, a broad man with scarred arms, spat into the water. Another child sick this morning, he muttered. The others looked uncomfortable. Aketo listened quietly while pretending to stack timber. What sickness? One worker asked. The scarred man shrugged. Fever, coughing blood. Another immediately made a protective gesture against evil spirits. Don't speak of it. It's true, the scarred man insisted. 3 dead, already near the lower canal. Menewa interrupted before the conversation continued. Rumors grow faster than weeds, the old man said sharply. Yet later, while carrying tools through the city, Aketo noticed more unsettling details. A woman burned herbs outside her doorway while whispering prayers. Near a public well, 2 men argued over spoiled grain. And at sunset, priests climbed one of the temple mounds, beating drums slower than before. Their faces painted black instead of red. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Not enough for panic, but enough for unease. That evening, Menewa rented sleeping space inside a crowded longhouse used by travelers. Nearly 40 people rested there already. Some snored softly beneath woven blankets, while others murmured around small fire pits. Aketo lay awake, listening to the city. Even at night, Cahokia remained alive. Dogs barked in distant alleys. Drums echoed from temple ceremonies. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried endlessly, and beneath everything flowed the constant sound of water, moving through canals and rivers, around the enormous city. Aketo rolled onto his side. "Uncle," Menewa grunted sleepily. "Do you think this city will last forever?" The old man stayed silent for a long moment. Outside, wind rattled the walls softly. Finally, Menewa spoke. "Nothing built by human hands lasts forever." Aketo frowned into the darkness. "But this place feels too large to disappear." Menewa gave a tired laugh. So did every city before it. The old man soon fell asleep, but Aketo remained awake much longer, because somewhere beyond the walls of the longhouse, drums continued beating deep into the ancient night. Slow, heavy, almost like a warning. The drums were still echoing faintly when dawn crept over Cahokia. Aketo woke before the others inside the longhouse. Thin gray light slipped through gaps in the wooden walls, revealing sleeping travelers wrapped tightly in blankets against the morning chill. Someone nearby snored loudly enough to shake the floorboards. Another man muttered in his dreams while clutching a small carved stone against his chest. For a few moments, Aketo forgot where he was. Then the distant roar of the city returned. Voices outside, dogs barking, water splashing against docks, and somewhere far beyond the crowded districts, a horn sounding low across the river. He sat upright slowly. The air inside the longhouse smelled of smoke, damp clothing, and too many people breathing through the night. Menewa remained asleep beside the wall, one arm draped across a bundle of trading goods. The old man's face looked older this morning somehow, the deep lines near his eyes sharper in the weak dawn light. Aketo quietly stepped outside. Cold mist hovered above the canals. The city looked almost peaceful before sunrise. Fires glowed softly in scattered homes, while fishermen prepared nets along the shoreline. Women swept dirt from doorways with bundled reeds. A few priests already walked toward the temple mounds, carrying bowls of ash and cedar branches. But the silence did not feel calm. It felt strained, as if the entire city had slept lightly. Aketo wandered toward the canal, where rows of boats rocked gently against wooden posts. He crouched near the water and splashed his face. The river smelled thick and muddy after yesterday's heat. Nearby, two fishermen argued in hushed voices. "I'm telling you, they sealed the southern house. You heard wrong. My cousin saw it himself." Aketo pretended not to listen. "The family died during the night," the first man whispered. "All of them." The second fisherman crossed his arms uneasily. "Stop talking like that before spirits hear you." Aketo looked up. The men noticed him immediately and stopped speaking. One gave him a suspicious glance before both returned to untangling fishing nets in silence. The young canoe builder stood slowly. That sickness again. Yesterday, it sounded like rumors drifting through crowded streets. Today, the fear beneath those whispers felt heavier. He returned to the longhouse, where Menewa was finally awake. Chewing dried corn while fastening bundles together. "You disappeared early," the old man muttered. "I couldn't sleep." Menewa nodded once. "Good. We work before the market crowds grow unbearable." The morning passed in exhausting labor. Traders from northern territories inspected cedar logs, while Menewa negotiated prices with stubborn patience. Aketo carried wood through busy market roads, where the city grew louder hour by hour. Sunlight spread across Cahokia's enormous plazas, revealing just how vast the settlement truly was. The central square swarmed with activity. Farmers arrived carrying woven baskets filled with beans and squash. Hunters displayed deer hides stretched across wooden frames. Musicians played reed flutes, while children danced in circles nearby. At the edge of one plaza, young men competed in chunky, the game Aketo had heard travelers describe for years. A stone disc rolled rapidly across packed earth, while players hurled long spears toward the moving target, trying to predict exactly where it would stop. Crowds shouted wildly with each throw. Bets changed hands constantly. Aketo paused to watch. One spear landed perfectly beside the disc. The crowd exploded with cheers. For a brief moment, the city seemed joyful again. Then a woman screamed somewhere beyond the plaza. Everything changed instantly. People turned toward the noise. A commotion spread near the western road, where several guards pushed through the crowd carrying staffs. Aketo climbed onto a low wooden platform to see better. Two men dragged a struggling figure, wrapped in blankets. The person inside coughed violently. Even from a distance, Aketo heard the terrible wet sound inside those coughs. People backed away quickly. Mothers pulled children aside. Some covered their mouths. The struggling figure reached one thin arm from beneath the blankets before collapsing weakly again. Aketo felt cold despite the growing heat. The guards shouted for the roads to clear. Nobody argued. Within moments, the sick person vanished into the western district, while frightened whispers spread through the plaza like wind through dry grass. Menewa appeared beside Aketo, carrying bundles of traded tools. "Do not stare," the old man warned quietly. "What's happening?" Menewa kept walking. Aketo followed quickly. I asked what's happening. "I don't know, but you've heard the rumors too. Every city carries rumors." Aketo grabbed his uncle's arm. "This feels different." Menewa finally stopped. The old trader studied the crowds carefully before lowering his voice. "When places grow this large, sickness travels quickly. Too many people, too much waste, too many strangers arriving from distant lands." Aketo glanced toward the western district. "You think it's spreading?" "I think," Menewa said carefully, "that cities are fragile things pretending to be permanent." The words stayed with Aketo long after they resumed working. Throughout the afternoon, he noticed details he had ignored yesterday. More smoke rose from purification fires outside homes. Certain market stalls stood empty. People avoided touching strangers when possible, and near one public well, priests painted symbols across nearby posts using red clay. By late afternoon, thick clouds rolled across the sky, trapping heavy humidity over the city. The air became sticky and difficult to breathe. Flies gathered everywhere. Aketo carried tools toward the canal district when he spotted a crowd gathered near the shoreline. Curious voices murmured nervously. He pushed closer. A canoe had arrived from the south, but something was wrong. The boat drifted half sideways against the dock, while 3 motionless bodies remained inside beneath woven blankets. Only one survivor sat upright near the stern, an old woman. Her eyes looked hollow with exhaustion. Dock workers hesitated to approach. Finally, several priests arrived carrying burning cedar branches. They surrounded the canoe cautiously while chanting prayers. The old woman tried speaking, but her voice cracked weakly. Aketo strained to hear. Villages empty, people dying, river cursed. One priest ordered everyone back immediately. The crowd scattered fast. Fear moved visibly now. Not whispers anymore. Something darker. Aketo hurried away before guards forced the area clear entirely. When evening finally came, thunder rolled across the horizon, though no rain fell yet. The sunset above Cahokia glowed deep red through heavy clouds, making the giant temple mounds appear almost black against the sky. Menewa rented a different sleeping place that night farther from the canal district. "Why move?" Aketo asked. The old man kept his expression neutral. Too crowded near the docks. But Aketo sensed another reason. Fear inside the new shelter. Travelers spoke quietly over small fires, while shadows flickered across the walls. A hunter from western forests claimed entire villages, now avoided Cahokia. A trader insisted crops were failing south of the river. Another man swore priests had seen a sign in the stars predicting disaster before winter. Nobody fully believed anyone else. Yet nobody laughed either. Aketo sat near the doorway listening, while rain finally began outside. At first it fell softly, then harder. Within an hour, storms hammered the city. Water poured from rooftops into muddy streets. Wind rattled walls violently. Thunder shook the ground beneath Cahokia, while lightning flashed across the massive central mound. For a moment, the entire city illuminated bright white. Aketo saw people running through rain below, saw priests climbing stairways carrying torches, saw crowds gathering in the plaza despite the storm. Then darkness swallowed everything again. A frightened child nearby started crying. The storm lasted deep into the night. Water leaked through portions of the roof. Travelers shifted, constantly trying to avoid dripping rain. Outside, the city sounded chaotic, dogs barking madly, people shouting through flooded streets, wooden shutters slamming in the wind. Aketo barely slept. Near midnight, the storm weakened enough for distant sounds to emerge again. Drums, slow and steady. Boom, boom, boom. Not celebratory rhythms. Ceremonial, the kind played during funerals back home. Aketo rose quietly and stepped outside beneath the shelter roof. Rain still fell lightly. Mist drifted through torchlit streets where muddy water flowed like tiny rivers between homes. Then he noticed movement. A line of people crossed the distant plaza carrying torches. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They moved silently toward the largest mound. Aketo narrowed his eyes. At the center of the procession walked priests dressed entirely in black feathers. Behind them, others carried long wrapped shapes upon wooden litters. Bodies. His stomach tightened. The procession disappeared slowly up the massive staircase, leading toward the summit temple. Lightning flickered far away beyond the clouds. For several moments, Aketo simply stood there listening to rain strike the earth. Then a quiet voice spoke beside him. You should not watch ceremonies meant for the spirits. Aketo nearly jumped. An elderly woman stood nearby, wrapped in a soaked fur cloak. He had not heard her approach. I wasn't trying to spy, he muttered. The woman studied him carefully. You're not from here. No. Good. Something about her tone unsettled him. What do you mean? The old woman glanced toward the great mound, where torchlights still climbed the stairs. This city has grown too large, she whispered. The earth beneath it groans from the weight. Aketo frowned. That makes no sense. She ignored him. Once there were forests here. Quiet water, birds, spirits could breathe. Her eyes remained fixed on the distant mound. Now the city consumes everything. Thunder rumbled again, far away. Aketo folded his arms against the cold rain. People said Cahokia was the greatest city in the world. The woman gave a sad smile. That is exactly why I fear for it. Before he could answer, she turned and vanished into the darkness between buildings. Aketo stared after her uncertainly. Rain dripped steadily from the roof edges. Far above the city, atop the enormous mound, tiny flames continued flickering through the stormy night, while funeral drums echoed endlessly across ancient Cahokia. By morning, the rain had transformed large parts of Cahokia into mud. Water pooled beside homes and overflowed into narrow pathways between crowded districts. Workers struggled to clear blocked drainage ditches with wooden shovels, while children splashed barefoot through filthy puddles despite their parents shouting after them. Aketo followed Menewa through the soaked streets, carrying bundles of traded copper tools beneath an oilskin covering. The city smelled different after the storm. Worse, wet ash, rotting waste, stagnant water, and underneath, it all lingered the sour scent of too many bodies packed tightly together. Clouds still hung low overhead, turning the giant city gray and dim despite the rising sun. The markets were quieter today. not empty, but subdued. Fewer musicians played near the plazas. Traders spoke in lower voices. Many people kept glancing toward the western districts, where smoke drifted steadily upward from purification fires. Aketo noticed fresh symbols painted on several doorways, now red handprints mixed with black lines. He pointed toward one as they passed. What do those mean? Menewa did not slow his pace. Warnings. Warnings for what? The old man sighed impatiently. You ask questions like a child. I am asking because nobody explains anything. Menewa finally stopped beside a crowded food stall. The old trader lowered his voice. Families mark homes where sickness entered. Some believe spirits will pass over marked houses. Aketo stared toward the painted symbols. And does it work? Menewa gave a humorless smile. If fear solved illness, nobody would ever die. They bought roasted maize cakes and continued toward the riverside workshops, where canoe builders shaped cedar logs beneath long shelters. Aketo usually loved such places. The smell of fresh-cut wood reminded him of home. The steady rhythm of carving tools felt comforting, but even here tension lingered. Several workers were missing. Others whispered constantly, while glancing toward the city center. A broad-shouldered craftsman named Talomik waved Menewa over. You heard about the southern canal. Menewa grunted carefully. I hear many things. Talomik leaned closer anyway. They closed the entire district. Aketo looked up sharply. Closed it. Guards everywhere, Talomik muttered. Nobody enters. Nobody leaves. Another worker interrupted nervously. My cousin says people inside are starving already. Talomik shrugged. Better hungry than dead. The conversation ended abruptly when a group of priests passed nearby carrying bowls filled with smoking herbs. Workers lowered their heads respectfully until the priests disappeared farther down the shoreline. Aketo returned to sanding cedar planks, but concentration came difficult today. The city felt wrong, not collapsing, not yet, but strained, like wood bending beneath too much weight. Around midday, horns sounded suddenly from the northern road. People throughout the workshop stopped working immediately. Another horn answered from farther away. Then another. Aketo stepped outside, beside dozens of others. Crowds were already moving toward the northern plaza. What now? He asked. Talomik spat into the mud. Probably more refugees. They followed the growing crowd through busy streets until the northern gate area came into view. Aketo froze. Hundreds of people stood outside the city. Families, travelers, hunters, children wrapped in blankets. Some carried baskets or tools. Others dragged small sleds loaded with belongings. A few simply sat in the mud, looking too exhausted to move. Guards blocked the road with long wooden barriers. The refugees shouted desperately. Aketo caught fragments of frightened voices. Our village burned. nothing left. Please. One woman held a thin child whose face looked pale and sweaty even from a distance. The guards refused to let anyone pass. Tension spread rapidly through the crowd watching from inside the city. Some people argued the refugees should enter before another storm arrived. Others shouted angrily that strangers carried sickness. A stone suddenly flew through the air. It struck one refugee man across the shoulder. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouting exploded from both sides of the barrier. More stones followed. Guards raised staffs, while people pushed violently against one another. Aketo stumbled backward as panic spread. A child screamed somewhere nearby. Menewa grabbed Aketo's arm hard. We leave now, but those people, now, the old trader practically dragged him away from the northern road, while confusion roared behind them. Even several streets away, they could still hear shouting. Aketo looked back once. The giant city gates remained shut, and outside them, hundreds waited beneath darkening skies. By afternoon, the atmosphere throughout Cahokia had grown darker still. Rumors spread faster than ever. Some claimed nearby villages were abandoning entire fields because workers kept dying. Others whispered that spirits living beneath the earth were angry over how large the city had become. Near the central plaza, Aketo overheard two priests arguing openly. That is not what the signs meant. You presume too much. The eclipses warned us. Enough. The younger priest walked away, visibly shaken. Aketo pretended not to notice. Late in the day, Menewa sent him alone to deliver carved paddles to a merchant near the upper district. The route led close to Monk's Mound itself, and Aketo could not stop staring upward as he walked. The mound dominated everything. Its massive terraces rose higher than forests. Workers carrying supplies climbed endless stairways toward the summit temple. Guards stood stationed at intervals along the path, watching the city below. Aketo slowed near the base. From this close, the mound felt impossible. Thousands upon thousands of baskets of earth must have been carried to create it. Entire generations of labor buried inside one gigantic monument. A voice interrupted his thoughts. First time seeing it up close. Aketo turned. A young woman stood beside a nearby storage building, balancing a basket against her hip. She looked perhaps a few years older than him, with dark braided hair tied using strips of dyed cloth. I saw it yesterday, Aketo admitted, but not this close. She smiled faintly. Everyone stares the first time. You live here. My whole life. Aketo glanced toward the towering mound again. What's at the top? Temples, houses, sacred fires. Her expression shifted slightly. And people who believe they speak for the sun. Before Aketo could answer, she extended one hand politely. I'm Issy. Aketo. You're northern. How can you tell? Your accent and your boots. She nodded toward his footwear. Nobody here uses stitching like that. Aketo laughed softly. The sound felt strange after such a tense day. Issy adjusted the basket against her side. You picked a bad time to visit. So everyone keeps saying. Her smile faded. My brother says the city is changing. Aketo folded his arms. Because of the sickness. Not only that. She lowered her voice slightly. Food prices rise every week. More guards patrol at night. Priests argue constantly. Nearby, drums echoed faintly from another district. Issy glanced toward the sound uneasily. Something feels wrong here now. Aketo thought of the refugees outside the gates, of funeral processions climbing the mound during storms, of whispered fears spreading through crowded streets. Yes, he admitted quietly. I think I feel it too. A horn suddenly sounded from somewhere high above the plaza. People around them immediately became still. Another horn answered, then another. Issy's face tightened. That means gathering. Gathering for what? But she was already staring toward the giant plaza ahead, where crowds had begun, moving quickly. Come, she said. Together, they followed hundreds of others into the vast central square beneath Monk's Mound. Aketo had never seen so many people gathered in one place. Thousands filled the plaza, maybe tens of thousands. The sheer scale overwhelmed him completely. Families stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the cloudy sky, while guards formed lines near the mound staircase. Priests carrying burning torches descended slowly from above, their feathered cloaks swaying in the wind. Then silence spread gradually across the crowd. At the summit of the mound, several figures appeared beside the great temple, even from far below. Aketo could tell one stood higher than the others. The Sun Chief. People lowered their heads around him. Issy did the same after a moment. Aketo copied her uncertainly. A priest's voice carried across the plaza. The spirits test Cahokia. The words echoed over the enormous crowd. Our city remains strong. Another priest raised both arms dramatically. The sickness comes from disorder, from broken harmony, from forgotten offerings. Murmurs spread through the people. Aketo noticed uneasy glances everywhere. Then the Sun Chief himself stepped forward. Even at this distance, his presence commanded attention. He wore a vast feathered cloak that moved in the wind like dark wings. The city will endure, he declared. The crowd answered with scattered cheers, but not everyone shouted. Aketo noticed many faces remaining silent, watching, worried. The Sun Chief continued speaking about ceremonies, obedience, and sacrifices needed to restore balance. Priests below repeated his words across the plaza so distant crowds could hear. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The southern districts will remain sealed until purification is complete. The plaza erupted instantly. Angry voices burst through the crowd. Some shouted in support. Others protested loudly. Aketo heard one woman scream, that her daughter remained trapped inside the sealed area. Guards tightened formation immediately. The Sun Chief raised one arm for silence. Our survival demands sacrifice. The words rolled across the giant city like distant thunder. Aketo felt Issy tense beside him. Then, somewhere deep within the crowd, a man shouted something impossible to fully hear. But Aketo caught enough. People starving. The man never finished. Guards surged toward the voice immediately. Panic rippled outward as people shoved away from the disturbance. Children cried. Several priests shouted for order. Above them, dark clouds thickened again. Aketo suddenly understood something terrifying. This city, enormous as it was, felt fragile now. Not because walls were breaking, not because enemies attacked, but because fear itself had begun spreading through its people. And fear, once loose inside a crowded place, moved faster than fire. That night, the city refused to sleep. Aketo could hear it even from inside the crowded shelter where he and Menewa rested. Voices drifted constantly through nearby streets. Doors slammed. Dogs barked without pause. Somewhere far away, drums continued their slow, endless rhythm beneath the heavy clouds hanging over Cahokia. The air felt hotter tonight. Thick, uncomfortable. Rain from the previous storm still lingered in muddy pools across the city. And insects buzzed everywhere around the lantern flames. Menewa sat near the doorway, sharpening a small carving knife, while Aketo stared into a weak cooking fire. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Aketo broke the silence. "Do you believe the Sun Chief?" The old man kept sharpening the blade. "About what?" "That the city will survive." Menewa shrugged slowly. "Rulers always say cities will survive. That isn't an answer." The old trader tested the knife edge with his thumb. When people become frightened, leaders promise strength. Priests promise meaning. Traders promise stability. He slipped the knife away. But fear listens to nobody forever. Aketo watched the fire crackle softly. Outside, hurried footsteps splashed through muddy streets. "They should open the gates," he muttered. Menewa looked up sharply. "And invite sickness deeper inside. They're leaving people to starve." The old man sighed heavily. "You think there are easy choices now." Before Aketo could respond, shouting suddenly erupted nearby. Both turned immediately toward the doorway. Several voices argued somewhere outside in the darkness. A woman screamed angrily. Then came the sound of something breaking. Menewa stood at once. "Stay here." But Aketo followed anyway. Rain mist drifted lightly through the narrow street outside. Torches flickered against wet walls, while dozens of people gathered near a storage hut farther down the road. Two guards struggled to restrain a man covered in mud. "I know there's grain inside," the man shouted. "You'll feed us rotten scraps, while priests feast on the mound." One guard struck him hard across the face with a staff. The crowd gasped. The man collapsed into the mud, but kept shouting anyway. "My children are hungry." More people began yelling now. Some cursed the guards. Others demanded silence before trouble spread further. Aketo noticed something unsettling in their faces. Not just fear anymore. Anger. The guards dragged the bleeding man away, while the crowd slowly dispersed beneath muttered arguments. A thin woman near Aketo shook her head bitterly. "First the sickness," she whispered. "Now the food disappears." Menewa immediately guided Aketo back toward the shelter. "Do not involve yourself in city problems." Aketo glanced back once more. The muddy street had already emptied, but the tension remained hanging in the warm night air like smoke. Sleep came slowly afterward. Aketo dreamed of enormous wooden walls sinking beneath dark water, while drums echoed from somewhere underground. When dawn finally arrived, the city looked worse. Gray clouds still blocked most sunlight, giving Cahokia a dim, lifeless appearance. Smoke drifted low between buildings. More market stalls stood abandoned today, their woven coverings flapping weakly in damp wind. And everywhere people whispered. Menewa decided they should finish remaining trades quickly and prepare to leave within several days. "This place grows dangerous," he said quietly while tying cedar bundles. Aketo nodded, though part of him felt strangely disappointed. Despite everything, Cahokia fascinated him. Its endless noise, its crowded waterways, its giant mounds, even its fear felt enormous. As they carried supplies toward the western workshops, Aketo noticed fresh guard patrols throughout the streets. Some guards now carried painted shields instead of simple staffs. Issy appeared suddenly from a side alley. "You heard?" she asked breathlessly. Aketo frowned. "Heard what?" "They found bodies near the southern canal." Menewa muttered something under his breath. Issy continued speaking quickly. "Not sickness this time. Violence." Aketo felt cold, despite the humidity. "What happened?" "Nobody knows." She glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "Some say families tried, escaping the sealed district during the night." Menewa interrupted immediately. "Rumors again." But Issy shook her head. "My cousin saw the bodies himself." The old trader's expression tightened slightly. "That changes nothing. We continue working." He walked ahead without waiting. Issy watched him disappear into the crowd before turning back toward Aketo. "Your uncle thinks ignoring danger makes it smaller. He thinks surviving matters more than panic." She folded her arms. "Sometimes panic arrives because danger is real." They continued walking together through muddy streets lined with crowded homes. The city felt restless this morning. Groups gathered at corners, speaking in hushed voices. Priests carrying smoke bowls moved constantly between districts. Twice, Aketo saw families loading belongings into canoes near the canals. Leaving, Issy noticed too. People are starting to run. Aketo looked toward the river. "Would you leave?" She hesitated, My family has lived here generations. Her eyes drifted toward Monk's Mound, rising above distant rooftops. But lately, sometimes, I barely recognize this place. Before Aketo could answer, loud horns echoed suddenly across the city. Not ceremonial horns, alarm horns. People froze instantly. Another blast sounded closer this time. Then shouting erupted somewhere ahead. A crowd surged through the street toward them. "Move," someone yelled. "Get inside." Aketo grabbed Issy's arm before the rushing crowd knocked her down. People sprinted past carrying children and baskets. Others slammed shutters closed across windows. "What's happening?" Aketo shouted. Nobody answered clearly. Fragments reached him through the chaos. Southern barricade. They broke through. Sick people. The words spread panic immediately. Guards rushed down the street, pushing civilians aside. Aketo caught sight of several carrying spears, now instead of staffs. Spears. The city had crossed into something worse. Menewa reappeared from the crowd, looking furious. We returned to the shelter now, but the roads were already becoming impossible. Too many frightened people clogged the streets. Mothers dragged crying children through the mud. Traders abandoned goods entirely. Somewhere nearby, glass-like pottery shattered loudly. Then Aketo heard coughing. Harsh, wet, desperate. The crowd parted suddenly around a thin man stumbling through the street. Blood stained his mouth. People recoiled in horror. The man collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath, while terrified civilians backed away screaming. A woman dropped her basket of corn and fled immediately. Guards arrived seconds later. "Clear the road." Nobody resisted. Aketo stood frozen, while the guards wrapped cloth around their faces before approaching the sick man. One guard touched his neck briefly, then looked up grimly. Dead, the body remained lying in the muddy street, while rain began falling lightly again. Nobody moved closer. Issy whispered beside Aketo. "It's spreading." No one answered her, because everyone already knew. The next hours blurred together in confusion. Rain strengthened steadily, while guards attempted controlling panicked crowds across the city. Some districts closed entirely. Fires burned constantly beside temples, where priests prayed beneath soaked feather cloaks. Aketo, Menewa, and Issy finally reached a storage shelter near the central plaza, where dozens of others already gathered from the storm. Thunder rolled overhead. Inside the crowded building, frightened conversations overlapped endlessly. They should burn the southern district. My brothers trapped there. The priests angered the spirits. No, traders brought disease from the coast. An old hunter, sitting near the wall, shook his head slowly. "Cities aren't meant for this many people," he muttered. Nobody argued. Aketo sat near the entrance, watching rain hammer the plaza outside. Water streamed down the enormous staircase of Monk's Mound like tiny rivers. Priests still moved along its terraces, carrying torches protected beneath animal hides. Even now, ceremonies continued. Issy settled beside him quietly. "When I was little," she said softly, "I thought this city could never fall." Aketo looked toward the giant mound. "So did I, and I only arrived days ago." She almost smiled at that. Almost. A sudden commotion interrupted them. 2 guards entered the shelter, carrying another man between them. The man trembled violently beneath soaked blankets. People backed away instantly. "He needs warmth," one guard announced. Nobody moved. Fear filled the room like smoke. The guards laid the sick man near a small fire anyway. His breathing sounded terrible, ragged, and uneven. Aketo noticed dark stains across the blanket, covering his chest. Blood again. An older woman near the back of the shelter began quietly praying. Others joined her. Outside, thunder cracked so loudly the entire building shook. Then the sick man opened his eyes, suddenly. For one horrifying moment, he stared directly at Aketo. The man looked terrified. Not angry, not violent, simply terrified. He tried speaking, but dissolved into violent coughing instead. Blood splattered across the floor. Several people screamed. The guards shouted for everyone to stay calm, but panic had already exploded. Civilians rushed toward exits despite the storm outside. One child fell during the chaos and vanished beneath scrambling feet before her mother dragged her back upright. Menewa grabbed Aketo roughly. "We leave now." Rain blasted them immediately upon exiting the shelter. Wind howled through the massive city, while frightened crowds flooded the streets again. And above everything, towering over soaked rooftops and flooded plazas, Monk's Mound stood watching silently beneath the storm-dark sky, like some ancient, sleeping giant waiting to see what would happen next. The storm continued through most of the night. Rain hammered rooftops, overflowed canals, and turned the roads of Cahokia into thick rivers of mud. Water dripped constantly through cracks in the shelter, where Aketo, Menewa, and dozens of others huddled together in uneasy silence. Nobody truly slept anymore. Every cough inside the building caused heads to turn. Every sneeze made people shift farther away. Fear had changed the city faster than sickness itself. Aketo sat awake beside the doorway watching lightning flicker across the distant plaza. Each flash illuminated Monk's Mound rising above the darkness, enormous and unmoving, while the city below seemed to unravel piece by piece. Near midnight, a man across the shelter began breathing strangely. At first it sounded like quiet wheezing, then worse. People nearby slowly moved away from him. His wife held his shoulders tightly while whispering prayers against his forehead. The man's skin glistened with sweat even in the cold, damp air. Aketo could hear the terror in the woman's voice. "Please," she whispered, "stay awake." No one offered help, not because they lacked compassion, because they were afraid. The man's breathing became rougher as the hours crawled onward. Eventually, 2 guards arrived carrying torches and cloth masks tied around their faces. The woman started crying immediately. "No," she begged. "He's getting better." The guards did not argue. One gently lifted the man beneath his shoulders, while the other wrapped blankets around him. The sick man barely seemed conscious anymore as they carried him outside into the storm. His wife tried following. A guard blocked her path. He must go to the purification house. The woman collapsed screaming. Nobody in the shelter spoke after that. Only rain, only thunder, only distant drums somewhere beyond the flooded streets. By dawn, the storm had finally weakened, but Cahokia looked wounded. Floodwater filled entire sections of the lower districts. Broken baskets, dead chickens, and floating debris drifted through canals beside overturned boats. Several small homes near the riverside had partially collapsed into mud during the night. Smoke no longer rose from many cooking fires. Too many people were afraid to gather closely now. Menewa decided they needed supplies immediately before panic worsened. "Food first," he muttered while fastening his cloak. "Then we prepare to leave this place." Aketo nodded without argument. Even he now felt the city changing into something dangerous. The streets were strangely quiet as they moved through them. Not empty, but subdued. People avoided eye contact. Families carried belongings toward the rivers whenever possible. Guards stood at major crossings gripping spears instead of staffs now, their expressions tense beneath painted masks. Near the western district, Aketo saw workers dragging bodies wrapped in reed mats toward large fires burning beyond the plaza. He looked away quickly. The smell followed anyway. Issy met them near a grain market that had only partially opened. "There's barely anything left," she warned. She was right. The market looked half abandoned compared to previous days. Traders guarded their remaining supplies nervously, while crowds pressed dangerously close around food stalls. Arguments erupted constantly. Aketo watched one old man nearly stabbed over dried fish before guards intervened. Menewa pushed through the crowd with grim determination. "Stay close," he ordered. The grain seller they approached looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. "Prices doubled this morning," the seller announced before anyone even spoke. People nearby immediately began shouting. "Double, you thief! We'll starve." The seller slammed one fist against his table. "Then grow your own grain in floodwater." Silence followed that, because nobody had an answer. Menewa traded reluctantly for several small sacks, while Aketo noticed something disturbing nearby. 2 boys no older than 12 quietly stole maize from another stall and vanished into the crowd before anyone stopped them. Nobody chased them, perhaps because hunger already made such things understandable. as they prepared to leave. Sudden screams erupted farther down the market road. The crowd surged backward violently. Aketo nearly lost balance in the mud. "What now?" Issy muttered. Then he saw the smoke. Not cooking smoke. Black smoke. A building near the southern edge of the market burned fiercely, while people rushed away carrying baskets and children. Flames climbed rapidly through the dry roof, despite recent rain. The fire spread from purification torches. Someone shouted. No, another voice yelled back. People started it. Panic exploded instantly. Crowds shoved against one another, trying to escape narrow streets, while guards attempted clearing paths through the chaos. Aketo felt someone slam hard into his shoulder. A woman carrying a crying child stumbled past, covered in ash. The fire roared louder. Strong wind pushed sparks across nearby rooftops. Menewa grabbed Aketo's arm immediately. "We move," but escaping proved difficult. Too many terrified people crowded the roads now. Some tried saving belongings from nearby homes, while others simply fled blindly through mud and smoke. Issy covered her mouth against the thickening air. "This way," she shouted. She led them through a narrow side passage between storage huts, while smoke rolled overhead in dark waves. Aketo heard roofs cracking somewhere behind them. Then came another sound. Bells, huge ceremonial bells, ringing wildly from the temple district. Not slow funeral rhythms this time. Fast, urgent, alarm bells. The entire city seemed to react at once. More screaming followed. Aketo emerged from the alley into a smaller plaza and froze. People were fighting, not guards against civilians, neighbors against neighbors. Two men wrestled beside a water trough, while others shouted accusations around them. "You brought this sickness. My family has lived here longer than yours." Someone threw a stone. Another man pulled a knife. The city was coming apart. Menewa stared grimly. "We leave today." No one argued anymore. They hurried toward the riverside districts, where hundreds of others clearly had the same idea. Canoes crowded the canals, while families loaded whatever belongings they could carry. Children cried everywhere. Dogs barked frantically. Several boats had already overturned in the panic, spilling supplies into muddy water. Aketo looked across the canal toward the great central plaza. Even from here, he could see huge crowds gathering beneath Monk's Mound again. Priests in black feather cloaks stood upon the terraces, raising smoke bowls toward the sky, while drums thundered across the city. Issy followed his gaze uneasily. "They're calling for another ceremony." Menewa spat into the water. "Ceremonies will not save this place." Yet, despite his words, many people still moved toward the mound instead of away from it. Fear drove people in different directions. Some fled, others searched desperately for meaning. Thunder rumbled again overhead, though no rain fell yet. The air felt strangely heavy. Aketo Aketo helped Menewa untie their canoe, while chaos spread through the shoreline district. Nearby, a woman screamed after a stolen basket. Two guards dragged a struggling man through the mud. An elderly priest stood knee-deep in water-chanting prayers toward the dark sky. Then suddenly, the drums stopped. The silence hit the city like a blow. Even the crowd seemed to pause. Aketo looked toward Monk's Mound. At the summit platform, priests had formed a circle around something large and wooden. A structure. No, a cage. Issy went pale beside him. What is that? Before anyone answered, a horn sounded from the mound. Then another. A priest's voice echoed faintly across the flooded city. Aketo could not hear every word from this distance, but he caught enough. It was offering, restore balance, spirits demand. The crowd near the plaza erupted into confused shouting. Aketo stared toward the distant wooden structure atop the mound. Movement shifted inside it. His stomach tightened. People. There were people inside. Issy stepped backward slowly. No. Menewa's face hardened instantly. We leave now. But Aketo remained frozen, because high above the collapsing city, beneath black storm clouds and rising smoke, the rulers of Cahokia were preparing to feed something to the gods. For a long moment, even the river seemed quieter. Aketo stood at the edge of the canal, staring toward Monk's Mound, unable to fully process what he was seeing. The city behind him was still collapsing into noise, shouting, crying, splashing water, breaking wood. But his attention had locked onto that distant summit. A cage, people inside it, and priests moving around it like they were preparing something final. Issy grabbed his sleeve hard. We have to go, she said, voice shaking. Now. Menewa didn't wait for permission anymore. He shoved their supplies into the canoe with fast, sharp movements. Get in, he ordered. Aketo finally broke his stare and stepped into the boat. But his eyes kept drifting back toward the mound. The crowd below it was growing again instead of dispersing. That was what unsettled him most. Even with fires, sickness, and panic spreading through the streets, people were still gathering there, still watching, still believing something might come from it. Issy climbed in last, hands trembling as she pushed the canoe off the muddy bank. For a moment, they were stuck in thick water, surrounded by other fleeing boats. Families argued in panic. Someone overturned a canoe nearby and screamed as their belongings sank. Guards shouted useless orders from the shoreline, while the entire riverfront turned into chaos. Menewa forced the paddle into the water. We move away from the shore, he said. Follow the current south. Aketo barely heard him. His attention stayed fixed on the city as it shrank behind them. Cahokia was no longer a single living system. It looked broken into fragments now, smoke rising from scattered fires, floodwater reflecting lightning, crowds spilling through streets like spilled grain, and above it all, the enormous mound still standing unchanged, unmoving, as if refusing to accept what the city had become. A deep horn sounded again from the temple summit, this time louder, longer, and then drums returned, slow at first, then accelerating. Boom, 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 boom. Issy whispered without looking back. They're starting it. Aketo didn't ask what it meant. He already knew. The canoe drifted farther into the river channel, away from the densest chaos. Other boats moved alongside them, some packed with entire families, others with only a single person fleeing alone. The river itself seemed overloaded with escape. Behind them, Cahokia's noise faded slightly, but not completely. Even from distance, the city still sounded alive in a painful way. Menewa kept paddling with steady force. "We do not return," he said firmly. "No matter what we hear." Aketo nodded, though his eyes still drifted backward. Issy sat low in the canoe, arms wrapped around herself. "They think sacrifice will stop it," she muttered. Menewa gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sickness does not bargain with sacrifice." The river widened as they moved farther south. Wetlands opened around them again, tall reeds bending in wind, birds lifting from shallow water, distant trees half submerged from recent storms. But even out here, something felt wrong. Not visible, just a feeling, like the land itself had been unsettled. Behind them, Cahokia became a dark shape on the horizon. Then the wind shifted, and the sound carried. Drums, still beating from the city. Even across distance, they reached the canoe clearly. Slow, controlled, relentless. Boom, boom, boom. Issy closed her eyes tightly. "I can still hear it." Menewa didn't answer. Aketo turned slightly, looking back once more. Far away, Monk's Mound rose like a shadow against the stormlit sky. At its peak, tiny fires flickered around the summit structure. The cage was no longer clearly visible, but the movement around it was unmistakable. People gathered there, not scattering, not fleeing, gathering. Then something changed. A sudden flare of fire erupted at the top of the mound, bright enough to cut through fog. The drums stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Aketo leaned forward, instinctively. "What happened?" he whispered. No one answered. For several seconds, nothing moved in the city. Then chaos returned, but differently. Not organized, not controlled. It spilled outward. Fires began spreading across multiple districts at once, not as ceremonial torches, but as uncontrolled burning. Smoke thickened rapidly, rising in dark columns that twisted together above Cahokia like wounded spirits. Shouting intensified again. This time it sounded less like panic, more like collapse. Menewa cursed under his breath. "They've lost control." Issy looked terrified. Who has lost control? But there was no clear answer anymore, because because from the river, it no longer looked like one group of rulers guiding a city. It looked like everyone was reacting to something none of them could contain. Aketo watched as movement surged through the central plaza again. People ran in every direction at once. Some toward the river, some toward the mounds, some simply into burning districts searching for family. The great order of the city, its planned streets, its organized districts, its carefully structured world was dissolving into pure motion. And still, the mound remained at the center of it all. Menewa paddled harder. "We do not stop," he repeated. "We keep moving south until land forgets this place." Aketo finally tore his gaze away. But even as he faced forward, he could still feel Cahokia behind him. Not as a place, as a presence, like something too large to disappear quickly. Hours passed. The river carried them deeper into wetlands, where human noise faded completely. Only birds remained now. Only wind. Only water against wood. But Aketo could not shake the memory of what he saw. The cage, the fires, the silence before collapse. At some point, Issy spoke quietly. "Do you think it will fall?" Menewa answered before Aketo could. "It is already falling." Night approached slowly, painting the wetlands in darker shades of gray and green. The canoe drifted under hanging branches, where insects gathered in thick clouds. Aketo sat silently, exhaustion pressing down on him. Then, just before full darkness arrived, he looked back one last time. Far on the horizon, where Cahokia once stood, a faint glow remained. Not one fire, many, spreading, and above it, barely visible through distance and smoke. The silhouette of Monk's Mound still rose for a final moment against the fatting sky, like a memory refusing to disappear. Night finally swallowed the wetlands. The canoe moved almost silently now, guided only by Menewa's steady paddling and the slow pull of the current. Reeds brushed against the sides of the boat like fingers trying to hold them back. Insects filled the air in thick drifting clouds, glowing faintly whenever distant lightning flashed far behind them. Cahokia was no longer visible, but it was not gone from Aketo's mind. It followed him in fragments. The cage, the drums stopping mid-beat, the sudden flare of fire at the summit, and then the way everything seemed to break open afterward, like a dam collapsing under unseen pressure. He sat low in the canoe, arms wrapped around his knees. Issy remained silent for a long time beside him. Her breathing was uneven, as if she was still listening for something that wasn't there anymore. Menewa did not speak at all. Only the water spoke now. Hours passed in that drifting silence. At some point, the river widened again, and the reeds thinned out, opening into a darker stretch of water where the current slowed. Menewa guided them toward a small bank covered in wet sand and fallen branches. "We stop here," he said finally. His voice sounded older than before. The canoe scraped softly against shore. None of them moved for a moment. It felt strange to be still after so much motion. Eventually, Aketo stepped out first. His legs almost gave way beneath him, not from injury, but from exhaustion. He steadied himself against the canoe and looked around. The world here was empty. No cities, no smoke, no shouting, only distant night insects and the faint rustle of trees. Ussie stepped out next, then sat immediately on the damp ground, holding her head in her hands. Menewa dragged their supplies onto the shore with slow, deliberate movements. Everything he did now felt heavier, like he was carrying more than just objects. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Ussie broke the silence. "It burned," she said softly. Aketo looked at her. "What?" "Cahokia," she whispered. "It burned." Menewa exhaled through his nose. "We do not know that." Ussie lifted her head sharply. "We saw it." The old trader didn't argue. He simply continued arranging supplies. Aketo sat down near the edge of the water, staring into the dark reflection of the sky. "I think it broke before the fire," he said quietly. Both Ussie and Menewa turned slightly toward him. Aketo continued, choosing words carefully. "The sickness, the sealed districts, the anger in the streets. It wasn't one thing. It was everything at once. Like the city was too full of itself." Menewa nodded once, slowly. "Large places carry too many edges," he said. Eventually, something cuts back. Ussie hugged her knees. But it wasn't supposed to end like that. Menewa gave a tired, almost empty laugh. Nothing is ever supposed to end the way it does. Silence returned. The river nearby moved gently, as if unaware of anything important happening in the world. Aketo lay back on the damp ground, staring up through branches into a sky full of scattered stars. For the first time in days, there was no drum, no shouting, no fear pressing in from every direction. Only distance, but his mind refused to settle. Instead, it kept returning to the same image. The summit of Monk's Mound, the fire flaring bright against storm clouds, and then silence. Not peace, something worse, uncertainty. After a while, Menewa spoke again, almost to himself. "Cities like that don't vanish cleanly." Aketo turned his head slightly. "What happens to them?" The old trader stared into the dark river. "They become stories." Ussie looked up. "That's all." Menewa nodded. "That is all anything becomes in the end." The words lingered heavily in the air. Later they ate in silence. Simple dried food. No fire, no noise, just chewing and water and exhaustion settling into their bones. At some point, Ussie fell asleep sitting upright, leaning against a fallen log. Menewa stayed awake longer, watching the river like it might change direction at any moment. Aketo couldn't sleep, so he walked a little away from the camp, stopping where the sand met shallow water. He knelt and touched the surface. Cold, real, unmoving compared to everything that had happened. In that reflection, he saw himself not as someone who had witnessed a city fall, but as someone too small to ever understand it fully. Behind him, Manwa's voice called softly, "Do not wander far." Aketo didn't answer. He stayed there a moment longer, then returned slowly. When he lay down again, sleep finally came, but it was shallow, filled with drifting images. Crowds, fire, drums, a giant mound against a black sky, and beneath it all, a feeling that refused to leave. Not just that a city had fallen, but that something far larger than a city had briefly existed there, and had now slipped back into the earth without fully explaining itself. At dawn, the wetlands were pale gold. Mist rose from the water in thin, drifting layers. Birds called from far-off trees. The river moved as if nothing had ever happened in the night before. Menewa was already awake, packing their remaining supplies. "We continue south," he said. Ussie nodded quietly, still half asleep. Aketo stood and looked once more toward the direction they had come from. There was no smoke visible anymore, no fire, only horizon. He wondered if anyone would ever believe what he had seen. A city bigger than imagination, a city alive with thousands upon thousands of voices, a city that had believed itself permanent. And then, silence. He turned away and stepped back into the canoe. The river carried them forward. The canoe moved steadily south as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of morning mist. Wetlands stretched in every direction, now endless reeds, shallow water, and scattered islands of trees that looked untouched by human hands. It felt like entering a world that had never heard of Cahokia at all. But Aketo knew better. Even if the city was no longer visible, it was not gone from the land itself. Not yet. Menewa paddled in a slow rhythm, shoulders tight with exhaustion that had settled deep into his body. Ussie sat quietly, staring at the water as if expecting something to rise from it. No one spoke for a long time. Eventually, the silence became heavier than the river. Aketo broke it. "Will people still go there?" he asked. Menewa didn't look up. "To where?" "To Cahokia." The old trader hesitated. "That depends on what remains." Ussie finally spoke, voice soft. "If anything remains." Aketo stared ahead. "They built it for generations," he said. It didn't feel like something that could disappear in a single season. Menewa gave a tired, almost distant response. Everything built by generations can be undone by generations as well. The canoe drifted past a broken stretch of shoreline where old wooden posts stuck out of the water like forgotten teeth. Half-sunken baskets floated nearby, tangled in reeds. Aketo watched them pass slowly. Signs of people were everywhere now, even far from the city. Not cities, not settlements, just traces. A broken tool here, a discarded pot shard there. The land remembered more than it showed. Ussie shifted slightly, wrapping her arms tutta around herself. "Do you think the sickness will spread out here too?" she asked. Menewa answered without hesitation. "It already has." Aketo looked at him sharply. The old trader continued, still focused on paddling. "People travel, boats move. Trade never stops completely. What begins in one place does not stay there." That answer settled heavily between them. The river widened again, splitting into smaller channels that twisted through dense vegetation. The canoe slowed as Menewa guided it carefully through shallow turns. At times, they had to push through thick reeds by hand. The world felt smaller here, quieter, but not safer. Around midday, they stopped on a narrow strip of land to rest. The air was humid, heavy with the smell of wet earth and plants. Menewa checked their remaining food carefully, dividing it without speaking. Ussie watched him. "We should find other travelers," she said. Menewa shook his head. "No, why not?" He tied a bundle tightly. "Because travelers bring stories, and stories bring panic." Aketo frowned. "Isn't panic already everywhere?" Menewa looked at him then, briefly. "Yes, that is why we avoid adding more of it." They ate in silence again. Aketo couldn't stop thinking about the mound, not as a structure, but as a presence, a place where thousands gathered daily believing in order, in balance, in control, until none of it mattered anymore. He wondered if the people who had stayed had believed until the very last moment, or if belief had already broken before the collapse began. After they resumed travel, the landscape gradually changed. The wetlands gave way to firmer ground, then scattered groves of forest. The river narrowed, its current becoming more defined, pulling them along a clearer path southward. Occasionally, they passed distant smoke columns, small settlements hidden among trees. Life still existed beyond Cahokia. That was the strange part. The world had not ended. Only one place had. By late afternoon, Ussie finally spoke again. "My brother once said the city would never fall because it was too large," she said quietly. Aketo looked at her. "What do you think now?" She hesitated. "I think size doesn't protect anything," she said. "It only hides the cracks longer." Menewa gave a short nod, as if that was the only conclusion he had ever accepted. As evening approached, they found a wider stretch of riverbank suitable for stopping. The sky turned orange through thin clouds, reflecting softly on the water. Menewa pulled the canoe ashore. "This is where we stay," he said. No one argued. They set camp quickly, movements quieter than before. The energy that once surrounded travel had changed. Everything felt more cautious now, as if the world might suddenly shift again without warning. As night settled in, Aketo sat near the water's edge. The river flowed calmly past him, carrying small bits of wood and leaf. He imagined those fragments traveling far downstream, joining other rivers, reaching other lands, maybe even carrying traces of Cahokia with them. Not fire, not smoke, but memory. Issy came to sit nearby. "Do you think anyone will rebuild it?" she asked. Aketo considered the question carefully. "I think they will try," he said. She looked at him. "And fail." "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe what they build next will look different enough that no one calls it the same thing." Menewa, sitting a little distance away, spoke without turning. "Cities do not return as they were," he said. "They return as echoes." The word lingered. Echoes. Aketo looked into the dark water again. In the reflection, the sky above looked endless, and for the first time, he realized something unsettling. Cahokia had felt endless too, until it was. Night deepened slowly around them. The river continued moving, indifferent to memory, carrying them farther away from what had been the largest place Aketo had ever known. Behind them, somewhere beyond forests and wetlands and silence, the ruins of a great city remained under smoke and rain, not erased, not fully understood, just left behind. And ahead of them, the world continued without waiting. The days that followed blended into a long, quiet passage of river and land. The farther south they traveled, the more the memory of Cahokia began to feel like something that belonged to another life entirely. Not because it faded, but because the world around them refused to acknowledge it. Birds still nested. Fish still moved through the water. Trees still grew as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened upstream. Aketo found that the hardest part was not the collapse itself. It was how ordinary everything else remained. Menewa continued guiding them with the same steady discipline, choosing safer currents, avoiding crowded crossings, and stopping only when necessary. Issy adapted quickly, learning how to read the river's changes, how to predict shallow ground, how to recognize distant smoke before it became danger. But none of them spoke often about the city anymore, not because they forgot, because there was nothing new left to say. One afternoon, while they drifted through a narrower channel bordered by tall cypress trees, Aketo finally broke the silence again. "Do you think it was always going to end like that?" he asked. Menewa didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the paddle, guiding the canoe around a submerged log. "No," he said at last. Aketo looked at him. "Then why did it?" The old trader exhaled slowly. "Because nothing that large can stay balanced forever. It grows faster than its understanding of itself." Issy listened quietly from the middle of the canoe. Aketo frowned, but they believed it was strong. Menewa gave a small, tired nod. Strength is not the same as stability. That answer settled into the water between them. The river widened again later that day, opening into a calm basin where the current slowed. They stopped near a sandbank surrounded by low grass. The air was warm, filled with the sound of insects and distant birds. As they rested, Issy began gathering small branches. "We should have a fire tonight," she said. Menewa nodded. "Careful one." Aketo watched as she built it, striking flint until a small flame finally caught. The fire felt different now than it had before Cahokia. Less comforting, more necessary. A tool, not a gathering place. As the flames rose, shadows stretched across the sand. Aketo stared into them. "Sometimes I still hear the drums," he admitted quietly. Issy looked up. "So do I." Menewa didn't react, but his expression tightened slightly. "They will fade," he said. Aketo wasn't sure if that was true. The night deepened slowly around them. Above, the sky opened into a wide scatter of stars. The river reflected them in broken fragments, shifting constantly with the current. At some point, Issy fell asleep near the fire, curled into herself for warmth. Menewa stayed awake longer, sitting with his back to a fallen log, watching the dark water. Aketo remained beside him. After a long silence, Aketo asked something he hadn't dared to earlier. Was Cahokia the biggest city there ever was? Menewa didn't answer right away. He seemed to consider the question not as fact, but as weight. "People say many things," he replied finally. "Some say yes. Some say there were others like it. Some say it was never as large as it seemed." Aketo frowned. "But you were there." Menewa looked at him briefly. "I was there," he agreed. "And—" The old trader turned his gaze back to the river. It felt large enough to swallow the world. That was the closest thing to confirmation he gave. Silence followed. Aketo lay back on the sand, staring upward again. He imagined the city as it once was: crowded canals, endless markets, stairways filled with footsteps, voices overlapping like waves. A place so full of life it had seemed permanent. And then he imagined it emptied. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until even its name might one day feel uncertain. Morning came gently. No storms, no warnings, just light spreading slowly across the river. Menewa packed their belongings. Issy folded the last of their blankets. Aketo stepped toward the water's edge, one final time before they left. He looked downstream. The river stretched endlessly forward, disappearing into bends and forests and distance. Somewhere far behind them, Cahokia no longer existed as a living city, but it still existed in something else now. Not stone, not wood, not people, but in the path of those who had left it behind. Aketo turned back to the canoe. He climbed in without speaking. Menewa pushed them off the shore. The current caught them gently and carried them onward. And as they moved farther away, the river kept flowing, as it always had, as it always would, carrying fragments of everything: cities, memories, voices down into a world that never stopped continuing. No matter what had fallen behind, the river carried them for many more days. And with each passing stretch of water, Cahokia became less like a place they had just left, and more like something buried deep inside memory, not erased, just distant enough that it no longer shaped every moment of silence. The wetlands slowly gave way to broader landscapes again, rolling banks, scattered forests, and quiet stretches where the river split into smaller streams before rejoining farther ahead. Occasionally, they passed small settlements. A few huts near the shore, fishermen pulling nets, children watching the canoe drift by without speaking. Life continued. That was what unsettled Aketo most. He had expected the world to feel changed after what he had seen, as if everything downstream would carry the weight of collapse. But it didn't. People still argued over fish prices, still repaired broken nets, still laughed near cooking fires. The world had not paused. Only one city had. One evening, as they camped on a wide river bend surrounded by tall grass, Issy broke the quiet again. "I had a dream," she said. Aketo turned slightly. "What kind?" Her eyes stayed on the fire. "I was back there," she said softly. "In the city, but it was empty. No people. Just the mounds standing in water." Menewa listened without interrupting. Issy continued, "And I kept walking through the plazas, but every step echoed too loudly. Like the city was listening to me, even though no one was there." Silence followed her words. Aketo understood what she meant too well. Menewa finally spoke. "Dreams are just the mind rearranging fear." Issy shook her head slightly. This didn't feel like fear. She hesitated. It felt like what comes after fear. No one responded to that. The fire crackled quietly between them. Later that night, Aketo sat alone near the river while the others slept. The water was calm, reflecting the stars in thin, broken lines. Somewhere far away, an owl called from the trees, its sound carrying softly across the dark. He thought about the cage again. He had not seen what happened after the fire flared on the mound. No one in his canoe had stayed to witness it fully. Only fragments remained. Drums stopping, silence, fire rising, and then the feeling that something had crossed a point of no return. Aketo leaned forward, resting his hands on the ground. He wondered if the people who had stayed believed, even at the end, that the city would correct itself, that order would return, that balance would be restored, or if, at the very last moment, they had understood the truth, that large things do not correct themselves. They shift, or break, or vanish. Morning came again. Menewa decided they would follow a smaller tributary westward now, away from the main river. The reason, he said, was safety. Fewer travelers, less chance of conflict. Aketo did not question it. The canoe turned into quieter waters. The river narrowed again, becoming more intimate, enclosed by forest on both sides. Sunlight filtered through dense leaves in broken patterns across the surface of the water. It felt almost peaceful. Almost. At midday, passed the remains of an old wooden structure, partially collapsed into the riverbank. Its purpose was unclear, perhaps a storage platform, perhaps part of a forgotten settlement. Issy stared at it as they passed. "How many places like Cahokia are there?" she asked suddenly. Menewa didn't answer immediately. "Many," he said at last. Aketo looked at him. "Have you seen others?" The old trader hesitated just slightly before replying. "I have seen places that believe they will become Cahokia." That answer lingered heavily. Issy frowned. "And do they?" Menewa gave a faint, tired sound that was almost a laugh. "Sometimes they grow. Sometimes they vanish before anyone remembers their names." Aketo looked out at the forest sliding past them. "So what decides it?" Menewa adjusted the paddle. "Time." That was all he offered. As evening approached, they found a small clearing along the riverbank to rest. The air was cooler here, the forest denser, the sounds of insects louder. They built a small fire again, but this time the silence felt different. Not heavy, just thoughtful, as if each of them was beginning to understand something they had not been able to see before. That night, Aketo lay awake longer than usual. He stared into the fire until it reduced itself to glowing embers, and he realized something quietly unsettling. Cahokia was not the only story that mattered. It was only the one he had seen end. Behind it, there were always more rivers, more cities, more beginnings that did not yet know what they would become. And somewhere far upstream, long before he ever arrived, Cahokia itself had once been just another beginning too. The river continued moving through the night, carrying them forward without pause, as if nothing in the world had ever been lost at all. The forested river narrowed again in the days that followed, until the canoe seemed to move through a corridor of green rather than open water. Branches dipped low overhead. Roots twisted along the banks like dark veins. The soundscape changed to less wind, more insects, more distant bird calls echoing between thick trunks. Aketo noticed something subtle during these stretches. The further they traveled from Cahokia, the less often they spoke of it, not because the memory faded, but because it began to feel fixed, like a carved mark in stone, unchanging, already complete. Menewa became more focused on navigation, reading currents and shoreline shapes with quiet concentration. Issy adapted into silence more naturally now, often watching the water for long periods without comment. Yet even without conversation, Cahokia remained present between them. It lived in pauses, in glances, in the way none of them reacted strongly anymore to small disturbances in the river. One afternoon, the canoe drifted into a wide, slow-moving section where the water reflected the sky like dull metal. The heat was heavy, pressing down through the canopy. Menewa signaled for a stop. They pulled the canoe onto a muddy bank where the ground was softer, almost sinking underfoot. As they rested, Aketo walked a short distance into the trees. The forest here felt older than the wetlands they had left behind. Trees stood thicker, trunks covered in moss and climbing vines. The air smelled of damp bark and earth. He stopped near a fallen log and sat down. For a while, he simply listened. No city noise, no drums, no crowds, only the layered quiet of nature, continuing without interruption. Then, unexpectedly, Issy joined him. She sat beside him, without speaking at first. After a moment, she said, "Do you think the people who stayed knew what was coming?" Aketo considered the question carefully. "I think they saw pieces of it," he said, "but not the whole shape." Issy nodded slightly. "That's what scares me," she replied. "Not that it fell, but that it fell while everyone still thought it could be controlled." Aketo looked down at the ground. "I keep thinking about the moment before the fire," he said quietly. "When everything stopped, the drums, the movement, like the city itself hesitated." Issy glanced at him. And then it broke. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, just heavy with thought. After a while, they returned to the river bank. Menewa had already begun preparing the canoe again. "We continue before evening insects grow too dense," he said. No one argued. The canoe slid back into the water and resumed its slow forward motion. As dusk approached, the forest opened slightly, revealing a broader stretch of river once more. The sky turned pale orange through gaps in the trees. Aketo noticed something unusual ahead. A series of wooden posts rising from the water near the bank. Not broken like abandoned remnants. Deliberate, structured. Menewa slowed the canoe. Issy leaned forward. "What is that?" she asked. As they drifted closer, the shape of it became clearer. It was not a settlement, not a dock, but something older looking, possibly a boundary marker, or the remains of a long-forgotten crossing point. The wood was worn smooth by time and water, carved with faint symbols that had nearly disappeared. Aketo stared at them. He felt something strange, not recognition, but familiarity without meaning, as if the land itself had once carried messages in a language no longer used. Menewa guided the canoe carefully past the posts. "Do not touch them," he said quietly. Aketo looked at him. "Why?" The old trader hesitated. "Because some things are not meant to be remembered clearly." Issy frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense." Menewa kept his eyes on the water. "It does when you have seen enough places rise and disappear." They passed the structure in silence. Only the sound of water returned again. That night, they camped on a narrow strip of land surrounded by dense forest. The canopy overhead was thick enough that only fragments of stars could be seen. The fire was small, contained, controlled. Aketo sat opposite Menewa, while Issy slept nearby. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Menewa finally said something unexpected. When I was younger, he began, I once traveled north of a great settlement. Not Cahokia, another one. Aketo looked up slightly. Menewa continued slowly. It was large. Not as large as what we saw, but large enough that people spoke of it the same way, as if it would last forever. He paused. I returned many seasons later. It was smaller, broken into pieces. People said it had declined. Others said it had moved. Others said it never existed the way we remembered. Aketo listened closely. Menewa poked the fire lightly with a stick. Cities do not die in one moment, he said. They unravel. And by the time people agree it is over, most of it is already gone. Aketo stared into the flames. So what happened to that one? Menewa looked at him. It became stories too. Silence returned. This time, it felt final in a different way. Not an ending, but a pattern, a repetition across time that no single city could escape. Later, as Aketo lay down to sleep, he listened to the forest around them. Insects, wind, water, everything continuing. And he understood something quietly, without needing it spoken. Cahokia had not been an exception. It had been a moment, a large one, a loud one, but still only a moment in a much longer river of human movement. And like everything else carried by that river, it had passed downstream into memory. The fire dimmed, the night deepened, and the canoe, resting beside the shore, waited for morning so it could continue forward again. Morning arrived without ceremony. No storm, no alarm, no change in the river's rhythm. Just pale light filtering through dense branches and the slow return of birdsong across the forested banks. Aketo woke before the others and sat quietly beside the extinguished fire. The ash was still warm in places, holding onto the last trace of night. Around him, everything felt intact, as if nothing had ever broken anywhere in the world. That illusion lasted only a moment. Then memory returned. Cahokia was still there, not as sight, but as weight. Menewa began packing without speaking, folding their few remaining supplies with practiced efficiency. Issy helped in silence, brushing dirt from their belongings and tightening rope knots that didn't really need tightening. No one mentioned leaving. They simply resumed moving, as if the river itself had decided for them. By mid-morning, they were back on the water. The forest here felt denser again, branches forming archways above the canoe. The river narrowed and quickened slightly, guiding them through tighter curves where the current pulled more insistently. Aketo noticed that Menewa no longer hesitated at crossings. It was not confidence. It was acceptance, as if whatever uncertainty had existed before had been replaced by a simple rule. Forward is the only direction left. Issy broke the silence first. I keep thinking about the people in the cage, she said softly. Aketo looked at her. Menewa did not turn, but he listened. I don't understand it, she continued. Even at the end, Why gather everyone there? Why make it public? Aketo answered slowly. Because when things fall apart, people look for meaning in the collapse, even if it is the wrong kind. Issy frowned. That doesn't make it less cruel. No, Aketo agreed. It just explains it. Menewa finally spoke. Cruelty and belief often travel together in large places, he said. One gives the other permission. The canoe drifted through a stretch where sunlight broke sharply through the canopy, illuminating the water in shifting patterns. For a moment, everything looked almost peaceful again, but the peace felt fragile, like something painted over cracks. By afternoon, they reached a wider river junction where multiple currents met. The water here was faster, more chaotic. Floating debris spun in slow circles near the center before being pulled downstream. Menewa steered carefully. We stay to the right channel, he instructed. Aketo watched as the canoe slipped into the chosen path. The current immediately changed. Stronger, more direct. It felt less like drifting now, and more like being carried. Issy noticed it too. This river feels different, she said. Menewa nodded. It is leaving the wetlands. Aketo looked ahead. And going where? Menewa hesitated. Toward other people. That answer changed the air in the canoe slightly. Not fear, awareness, because other people now meant something more complicated than it once had. By late afternoon, they saw smoke again in the distance. Not the thick, uncontrolled smoke they had seen during Cahokia's collapse. This was thinner, rising in steady columns from a small settlement along the riverbank. Menewa slowed the canoe. Aketo watched carefully. Structures appeared gradually, wooden huts, fishing platforms, cultivated patches of land. People moved between them in small numbers, working, carrying, living. Normal life. But after everything they had witnessed, even normal life felt unfamiliar. Issy leaned forward slightly. Should we stop? Menewa studied the settlement for a long moment. Only to trade, he said. They approached cautiously. As they neared the shore, a few villagers noticed them and paused. No alarm was raised. No panic, just observation. One man stepped forward from the riverbank, holding a woven basket. He looked at them with mild curiosity. Travelers, he called. Menewa nodded. From upstream, the man glanced at their canoe. You come from the direction of the great city. A brief silence followed. Aketo felt it immediately, the weight of the question. Menewa answered carefully. Yes, the villager nodded slowly, as if that explained something he had already suspected. Strange times upstream, he said. No one in the canoe responded. The man continued. People come through here saying the rivers are unsettled, that cities are changing. Menewa's voice remained steady. Cities always change. The villager studied them a little longer. Then he gave a small shrug. We hear many stories, he said. Hard to know which are real. Aketo felt something tighten slightly in his chest at that sentence, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. They traded briefly, food for rope, dried fish for water containers, simple exchanges that required no explanation. No one asked more questions about Cahokia, or perhaps they already knew enough not to. When they pushed off again, the settlement remained behind them, small and ordinary against the vastness of the river. Issy watched it until it disappeared. "They don't know," she said quietly. Menewa answered without looking back. "Not yet." Aketo stared forward. "Do you think they ever will?" Menewa adjusted the paddle. "Eventually, everything reaches everyone," he said. "Just not at the same time." The canoe continued downstream. The river widened again, opening into long, slow stretches where the current became gentle and steady. The sky deepened into evening tones, orange fading into violet. Aketo leaned back slightly, exhaustion settling into his bones in a way that felt different now. Not from travel alone, from everything before travel, from witnessing something that could not be reversed. Issy eventually fell silent, resting her head against the side of the canoe. Menewa kept paddling, and Aketo watched the horizon. For the first time in days, he thought not about the fall itself, but about what would happen after it stopped being a memory and started becoming something else entirely. A story told by people who had never seen it. A warning without detail. A place reduced to a name. Cahokia, somewhere behind them, upstream. The river still carried what remained of it, not as a city anymore, but as fragments slowly dissolving into the world. Ahead of them, the river kept moving, and so did they. Night settled over the river again, but this time it felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just farther away from everything that had happened upstream, as if distance itself had begun to smooth the edges of memory. The canoe drifted slowly along a wide, calm stretch where the current barely pushed at all. Menewa had stopped paddling for the moment, letting the water carry them. Issy was asleep again, her breathing slow and steady, finally untouched by dreams she could describe. Aketo remained awake. He had stopped trying to measure how many days had passed since Cahokia. Time no longer felt like something that counted properly anymore. Only movement did. The river moved. They moved. Everything else stayed behind. Somewhere in the dark, frogs called from the riverbank in uneven rhythm. Small ripples touched the canoe's sides now and then, gentle enough to feel almost like hesitation. Menewa finally spoke without turning. "We will reach open trade routes soon." Aketo looked toward him. "Is that good?" The old trader gave a quiet shrug. "It means more people, more boats, more noise." Aketo thought about that. "And more stories." Menewa nodded faintly. "Yes, and less truth." That answer lingered longer than expected. Aketo looked down at the water. I keep wondering if anyone will ever believe what happened. Menewa was silent for a moment. Some will believe too much, he said. Some will believe nothing at all. Most will change it slightly so it becomes easier to carry. Aketo frowned. Even if they were there. Menewa finally glanced back. Especially if they were there. That was the end of the conversation. The canoe continued drifting through darkness. Later, long after Issy's breathing deepened into sleep again, Aketo noticed faint lights ahead. Not firelight from a single camp. Multiple points of light scattered along the riverbank. They grew clearer as they approached. A trading landing. Small clusters of boats tied together. Hanging lanterns. People moving between them even at this late hour. The river here did not sleep. Menewa guided the canoe toward the shore. "We stop," he said quietly. They pulled in beside other travelers. The landing was modest compared to anything like Cahokia had been wooden platforms, rope ties, temporary shelters made of cloth and reeds. But it was alive in a different way, controlled, practical, human in a smaller sense. A man approached them immediately, holding a lantern. "Trade or rest?" he asked. Menewa answered simply, "Both." There was no hesitation, no fear, no tension in the exchange, just routine. Aketo stepped onto the wooden platform and felt something strange in his chest. Normality, not the overwhelming scale of Cahokia, not the collapse, just people continuing. He watched traders negotiating quietly, boats being secured, meals being prepared, laughter in low tones from a nearby group. The world had not stopped. It had simply moved on, without asking permission. Issy woke as they docked, and followed slowly onto the platform. She looked around, confused at first, then quietly relieved. "It feels stable here," she said. Menewa nodded. Small places usually do. Aketo observed the settlement more carefully now. Nothing grand, nothing overwhelming, but also nothing breaking. No panic, no fear spreading through crowds, no cages on distant mounds, just ordinary life holding itself together in manageable pieces. He realized then that what had made Cahokia feel so different was not only its size. It was the belief that size meant safety, that being large made collapse impossible. Here, nothing was large enough to believe that. Menewa found a place for them to rest near the edge of the platform, away from the busiest traders. They set down their belongings and settled into a quieter corner. Firelight from nearby groups flickered across the water, reflecting in long, broken lines. Aketo sat watching it for a while. Then he spoke softly. "Do you think Cahokia will be remembered as what it was?" Menewa didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the river, toward the direction they had come from far beyond sight now, beyond forests and wetlands, and distance that mattered. "No," he said at last. Aketo frowned. "Then what will it become?" Menewa's voice was calm. a place that teaches whatever the listener already believes. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, just final in a way that felt natural. Issy leaned back against a post, watching the water. Then it will never really exist in the same way again, she said quietly. Menewa nodded once. No city does. Aketo looked down at his hands. For the first time, he understood that what he had witnessed was not only the end of something large, it was the beginning of something smaller, a transformation from lived experience into passing account, from sound and smoke and movement into words, and words, he realized, were never as heavy as the thing they described. Outside the platform, the river continued flowing through the night, endlessly, without memory, without pause, carrying everything forward, whether it was understood or not. Morning at the trading landing arrived with a kind of quiet order that Aketo was still not used to. No alarms, no drums, no crowds rushing in panic, just the steady movement of people waking, preparing food, checking boats, and negotiating trade, as if the world had always been this size. He stood near the water's edge while Menewa inspected their canoe, and Ussie collected small bundles of supplies they had purchased the night before. The river was brighter now under daylight, stretching wide and calm, carrying reflections of sky and passing birds. Aketo found himself thinking less about Cahokia with each passing hour, not because it mattered less, but because it had become harder to place inside the present, like a memory refusing to stay sharp. Menewa joined him briefly at the edge of the platform. "We stay one more half day," he said. Then we continue downstream toward the larger crossings. Aketo nodded. Will there be more places like this? Menewa looked out at the river. Many, he said, smaller, larger, some organized, some not. A pause. None the same. Ussie approached carrying dried food, wrapped in cloth. There are stories here already, she said. Aketo turned slightly. About Cahokia. She nodded. Some traders say a great city upstream is in chaos. Others say it burned entirely. Others say it was abandoned before anything happened. Menewa gave a quiet, almost tired exhale. So quickly, he muttered. Aketo frowned. But we just left. Ussie looked at him. That is not how distance works, she said gently. To them, we are already the past. The words settled strangely. Aketo watched a trader nearby, laughing with a customer over a simple exchange of woven rope. No sign that anything monumental had ever happened upstream. No sense that anything had changed at all. It made him uneasy in a way he could not fully explain. Later that morning, Menewa went to exchange the last of their copper tools. Aketo and Ussie remained near the canoe. The landing was more active now. More boats arriving. More voices overlapping in steady commerce. A man nearby sharpened fish hooks while speaking casually about weather patterns. A group of women repaired nets under shade cloth. Everything continued. Aketo finally said what had been building in him quietly since dawn. "It feels like it didn't matter here," he said. Ussie glanced at him. "What didn't?" He hesitated. "What happened upstream?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the river for a moment. "It mattered there," she said, "and it mattered to us." A pause. "But not everything that matters stays large." Aketo looked down at the wooden planks beneath his feet. "That feels wrong," he admitted. Ussie nodded slightly. "It does," but she didn't argue against it, because neither of them had a better explanation. When Menewa returned, he carried only what they needed. "We move soon," he said simply. The canoe was pushed back into the water just before midday. The trading landing slowly receded behind them as they entered a broader channel again. Other boats appeared more frequently now, some traveling alone, some in small groups, all following the river's direction as if it were the only map that mattered. The world felt larger again, but also more fragmented. Aketo noticed something subtle as they traveled. People did not share stories openly anymore when they passed each other. Not immediately. Instead, they watched first, measured distance, then spoke only when necessary, as if everyone understood that information had become something unstable. By late afternoon, they passed a group of travelers camped along the shore. One man stood and called out as they drifted by. "Where from?" he shouted. Menewa answered without stopping. "Upstream." The man nodded slowly. "Trouble there." A long pause followed. Menewa did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Depends who you ask." And they continued on. Aketo watched the camp disappear behind them. "That answer means nothing," he said quietly. Menewa responded without looking back. "It means everything." Evening came with softer light again, the river turning gold at its edges. They stopped on a quiet stretch of bank where reeds grew tall and thick. As they prepared to settle, Ussie spoke quietly while gathering wood. "Do you think it will grow again?" she asked. Aketo looked at her. "What will?" "The kind of place we left." Aketo thought about it, then shook his head slowly. "Not like that," he said. Menewa overheard and added without hesitation, "It will grow differently, somewhere else, in another shape." Ussie frowned. "How do you know?" Menewa sat down near the fire spot. "Because people do not stop building large things," he said. "They only change how they build them." Silence followed. The river nearby continued its steady movement. Aketo realized that what he had seen was not an ending in the way stories usually ended. There was no clean closure, no final silence that stayed permanent. Instead, there was continuation. Elsewhere, elsewhen, night settled slowly once more, as the fire grew small and controlled between them. Aketo lay back and stared up at the sky. The stars were unfamiliar, now in a different way, not because they had changed, but because he had. And somewhere far behind them, beyond forests and wetlands and the reach of travel, the memory of Cahokia continued to drift downstream too, breaking apart into fragments, spreading through voices, reshaping itself each time it was told, not as it was, but as it could be understood. And the river, indifferent to all of it, kept moving forward without ever needing to explain why anything had happened at all. The river carried them deeper into a region where the banks widened again, and human presence became more frequent, though still scattered and uneven. Small settlements appeared and disappeared along the shore like brief thoughts, some permanent enough to leave smoke trails, others barely more than cleared land and a few broken posts. Aketo began to notice something new in these places. People were not afraid of them anymore. Not exactly, but curious in a careful way. As if travelers from upstream now carried an invisible weight that needed to be measured before conversation could begin. At one such stop, Menewa traded for rope and salt, while Aketo and Ussi waited near the canoe. A young boy from the settlement watched them openly from a distance, then finally approached without fear. "You came from the great water city?" he asked. Aketo hesitated. He had not heard Cahokia described that way before. "Yes," he said. The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Is it true it touches the sky with its mounds?" Ussi glanced at Aketo briefly. Menewa, still nearby, did not intervene. Aketo chose his words carefully. "It is large," he said, "very large." The boy seemed satisfied with that. "What happened there?" he asked. That question carried differently now than it would have days ago. Not panic, not urgency, just curiosity. Aketo looked toward the river for a moment before answering. "It changed," he said simply. The boy frowned. "Everything changes," he replied, as if repeating something he had heard before. Then he ran back to the settlement without waiting for more. Ussi watched him go. "That's how it starts," she said quietly. Aketo looked at her. "What starts?" "Stories," she said, already simplified. Menewa returned with supplies. "We continue," he said. They pushed off again. The canoe slid into the current, leaving the small settlement behind. For a while, no one spoke. Aketo sat thinking about the boy's question. Not what had happened, but how quickly it had become something that could be asked casually, as if collapse, once witnessed, immediately became narrative material for others. The river narrowed again later that day, threading through thicker forest. The canopy closed overhead in places, creating long green tunnels where light shifted in broken bands across the water. It felt enclosed, but not threatening, just separate. Ussi eventually spoke again. "I keep thinking about the Sun Chief," she said. Menewa did not respond immediately. Aketo looked at her. "What about him?" "I wonder what he believed at the end," she said. Not what he said, what he actually believed. Silence followed. Menewa finally answered. People in power rarely get to admit doubt openly, he said, even to themselves. Issy frowned slightly. That seems like a prison. Menewa gave a short nod. In large places, he said, everyone lives inside different kinds of prisons. Aketo stared at the water. That includes us, he asked. Menewa didn't hesitate. Yes, the word was simple, final in a quiet way, but not heavy, just honest. By late afternoon, the forest opened into a broad bend where the river slowed again. The water here was unusually still, reflecting the sky so clearly it felt like another world beneath them. They stopped to rest. As they stepped onto the bank, Aketo noticed faint footprints in the mud-old ones, partially washed away. Not fresh, not recent, but human. He crouched to examine them. Menewa watched briefly. Many travel this river, he said. Aketo nodded slowly. I know, but something about the prince lingered in his mind. Not their presence, their direction. They did not all go the same way. Some upstream, some downstream, some crossing and disappearing into forest, as if the river had never belonged to one movement alone. Night came gently again. They built a small fire under open sky this time, the canopy thinner here, allowing stars to return in greater number. Issy sat closest to the flames. Menewa rested with his back against a tree. Aketo remained awake longer than the others. He listened to the river, and for the first time in many days, he noticed how many other sounds existed beyond memory. Wind in branches, small animals moving through grass, distant water shifting around stones. The world had not narrowed. It had expanded again, just without Cahokia at its center. Aketo thought about that carefully. For a long time, he had imagined the city as something that changed everything around it. But now, downstream, he was beginning to understand something different. It had not changed everything. It had only been one part of a much larger flow, a powerful one, a loud one, but still only a moment in a system that never stopped moving. He lay back slowly. Above him, the stars continued their indifferent pattern. Behind him, far upstream beyond distance and forest, the story of Cahokia continued to break apart into other stories, told differently in every mouth that carried it forward. And ahead of him, the river continued without memory of any of it, only direction. Dawn arrived softly over the river, without storm or sound, as if the world had decided not to announce anything new. Mist rose in thin layers from the water, drifting between reeds and low branches. The canoe rocked gently where it rested near the bank, untouched during the night. Around it, the forest felt calm again, no urgency, no pursuit, only the slow return of ordinary time. Aketo woke first. For a while, he did not move. He simply listened. No drums, no crowds, no collapsing cities. just water, wind, and distant birds calling into the morning light. It felt strange how quickly the absence of Cahokia had become normal, as if even memory had its own settling period. Menewa stirred behind him, sitting up slowly with the tired stiffness of someone who had carried more than distance for too long. Issy followed shortly after, rubbing sleep from her eyes, quieter than she had been since the beginning of the journey. No one spoke immediately. There was nothing urgent left to say. Menewa finally broke the silence. "We will reach wider routes by the next turn of the river," he said. From there, trade paths spread in many directions. Aketo nodded. "What then?" Menewa looked at him for a moment. "Then you choose where to stop," he said simply. That answer hung in the air longer than expected, not because it was complicated, but because it was. Issy stood slowly, brushing dirt from her clothes. "So this is it," she said quietly. "Just continuing." Menewa gave a small, almost invisible shrug. "That is what most life is." Aketo turned toward the river. The current moved steadily forward, carrying small leaves, broken reeds, and fragments of wood that would never return upstream. He thought about Cahokia one last time, not the fire, not the cage, not the collapse, but the beginning. The first moment, he had seen it through fog and thought it might be endless. That feeling now seemed distant, not false, just incomplete. He understood something then, without needing it explained. Greatness had not been the problem. Belief in permanence had been. Behind him, Issy picked up their remaining supplies. Menewa checked the canoe one final time. Aketo stepped forward and pushed the boat gently into the water. It moved easily, as if it had been waiting. They climbed in together. No ceremony followed, no final words, only the river receiving them again. The canoe turned with the current and began to move downstream, away from the quieter forest, and toward broader waters where other travelers would eventually appear, each carrying their own small stories, their own versions of distant events, their own incomplete understandings of something that had once been enormous. Aketo did not look back, not because there was nothing behind him, but because looking forward felt like the only honest direction left. The river widened gradually as they traveled, opening into a vast flow that stretched beyond sight. Birds crossed overhead in scattered formations. The sky cleared fully now, bright and endless. Issy sat quietly beside him. Menewa paddled with steady rhythm, and the world continued, unchanged in its movement, carrying them forward like it had carried everything before them. Somewhere far upstream, beyond forests, wetlands, and distance too large to measure, the memory of Cahokia remained, but not as a living place anymore, only as something carried downstream in fragments, in stories, in warnings, in questions that would never return the same answer twice. And the river, indifferent and endless, kept moving forward anyway.